Sometimes the very thing that makes you different becomes the reason someone falls in love with you. In a world that told Sarah she was too much, too tall, too different, one man saw her exactly as she was meant to be seen. This is not just a love story. This is a story about finding your tribe, about ancient wisdom meeting modern pain, and about how sometimes the most beautiful homes are built not with blueprints but with understanding. What happens when a 6'4" woman who spent her life shrinking herself meets a 7'2" Cherokee craftsman who builds with his hands the way his ancestors built with their hearts? What happens when mockery transforms into marvel, when rejection becomes the path to the most authentic love story you've ever heard? Sarah Martinez thought she knew what her future looked like, a life of ducking through doorways, shopping in men's sections, and pretending she didn't hear the whispers. But fate had other plans, plans that involved ancient Cherokee building techniques, a man whose hands could carve beauty from raw timber, and a love so genuine it would literally reshape the landscape around them. This is their story. A story that proves sometimes you have to be broken by the world before you can be whole with the right person. Sarah Martinez stood in the airport bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror that cut off at her shoulders. At 6'4", she had grown accustomed to seeing herself in pieces, fragments captured in mirrors designed for people who lived in a different vertical world than she did. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows under her eyes, as she prepared herself for another day of being too much in a world built for too little. She was 32 years old and had spent the better part of 3 decades perfecting the art of making herself smaller. Not physically, that was impossible, but emotionally, socially, professionally. She had learned to hunch her shoulders just enough to seem less imposing. She had mastered the subtle slouch that brought her closer to eye level with her colleagues. She had developed an entire vocabulary of self-deprecating jokes about her height, delivering them before anyone else could make her the punchline. The conference she was attending in Oklahoma City was like every other professional gathering she had endured. Corporate executives in their pressed suits and comfortable heels, networking over coffee and small talk, all of them existing in a world of standard proportions. Sarah worked as a software architect for a major tech company, and her brain was worth millions to them, but her body made meetings awkward, and corporate photos require special arrangements. She adjusted her blazer, specially tailored because off-the-rack clothing stopped existing in her size around the time she hit 6 feet in high school. The seamstress in Denver who had made this particular blazer had clucked sympathetically while taking measurements, suggesting perhaps Sarah might consider a career in modeling. It was the same suggestion she had been hearing for 20 years, delivered by well-meaning strangers who didn't understand that modeling required a specific type of tall. Not just any type of tall. Sarah's tall was athletic, broad-shouldered, strong. She had been a basketball player in high school and college, where her height was finally an advantage rather than a burden. But even there, in the one place where her body type was celebrated, she had faced the peculiar isolation that came with being exceptional. Teammates looked up to her literally and figuratively, but rarely saw her as just another person. She was always the tall girl first, Sarah second. The bathroom door opened and a woman entered, took one look at Sarah, and actually gasped. "Oh my goodness, you're so tall. Do you play basketball?" The question was delivered with the enthusiasm of someone who thought they were the first person ever to make this observation. Not anymore. Sarah replied with the patience she had cultivated over decades of similar encounters. She had learned that showing irritation only made people defensive, and defensive people became mean. "Well, you must hear this all the time, but you should be a model. With those legs, you could make millions." Sarah smiled, the polite smile she had perfected, the one that acknowledged the compliment while silently screaming that her worth extended far beyond her physical proportions. "I actually work in tech," she said, hoping to redirect the conversation toward her actual accomplishments. But the woman had already lost interest, having delivered her quota of unsolicited life advice to a stranger in an airport bathroom. She disappeared into a stall, leaving Sarah alone again with her fractured reflection. This was her life. A constant stream of comments, observations, and suggestions from people who felt entitled to discuss her body as if she weren't standing right there listening. Stall clerks who loudly announced there was nothing in her size. Airline employees who made dramatic productions of her need for extra legroom. Dates who spent entire dinners discussing her height as if it were the most fascinating thing about her. Or worse, who seemed threatened by it and spent the evening trying to cut her down to size with small cruelties disguised as jokes. She had learned to navigate a world of low doorways and short beds, of airplane seats that tortured her knees, and restaurant booths that required careful maneuvering. She had learned to shop for shoes in the men's section and pants in the tall section that never seemed quite tall enough. She had learned to duck and bend and accommodate herself to fit into spaces designed without her in mind. But more than the physical discomfort, She had learned to navigate the emotional landscape of being perpetually different. The way conversations stopped when she entered a room, as if her height had sucked all other topics of discussion from the air. The way men either fetishized her height or were intimidated by it, rarely seeing past it to the person she actually was. She had tried dating apps where she was upfront about her height, only to be met with responses that ranged from crude propositions to expressions of disbelief. She had tried not mentioning her height, only to see the shock and sometimes disappointment on dates' faces when she showed up. She had dated men shorter than her, who spent every moment trying to prove their masculinity wasn't threatened by her stature. She had dated men taller than her, who treated her height like a trophy they had won. Sarah left the bathroom and walked through the terminal, her wheeled suitcase trailing behind her like a loyal pet. At the gate, she surveyed the seating options with the practiced eye of someone who had learned that not all chairs were created equal. She found a spot where her knees wouldn't press into the seat in front of her and settled in to wait for her flight. The conference had been typical. Presentations about emerging technologies, networking sessions where she towered over clusters of colleagues, and the inevitable moments when her height became the focus of conversation instead of her ideas. She had given a presentation on machine learning algorithms that had received genuine enthusiasm and thoughtful questions, but the post-presentation conversations had somehow drifted to basketball and modeling suggestions. During lunch, she had found herself seated at a table where the other attendees seemed to arrange themselves around her height, as if it were a natural landmark. The conversation had flowed around her, occasionally including her, but she could feel the constant awareness of her physical presence affecting the group dynamic. It wasn't malicious, it rarely was, but it was exhausting. A man at the table had made a joke about the weather being different at her altitude, and everyone had laughed, including Sarah, because she had learned that good humor about her height made others more comfortable. But inside, she felt the familiar ache of being reduced to a single characteristic, of having her complexity flattened into a simple observation about her bones. She thought about her apartment in Denver, with its high ceilings that had been one of the primary factors in her decision to rent it. She thought about her custom bed, raised higher than standard to accommodate her long legs. She thought about the stepladder she kept for friends to reach, items she stored on high shelves, a small accommodation that always felt like an apology for taking up so much space. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "How was the conference? Meet any tall, dark and handsome strangers?" The message was sweet, supportive, but it carried the underlying assumption that had followed Sarah through most of her adult life. That finding someone tall enough to match her was the primary challenge in her romantic life. As if compatibility could be measured in inches, Sarah typed back a simple, "Conference was good, heading home now," and put her phone away. She didn't have the energy to explain that the problem wasn't finding men who were tall enough, but finding people who saw beyond her height to the person she actually was. Men who weren't interested in her as a novelty or a challenge or a way to prove something about themselves. Boarding announcement for her flight crackled over the intercom, and Sarah gathered her belongings. As she stood to join the boarding line, she noticed other passengers glancing up at her, some with curiosity, others with the kind of stare that suggested they were trying to determine if she might be someone famous. It was a familiar dance of attention that followed her everywhere. On the plane, she maneuvered into her seat, an aisle seat she had specifically requested and paid extra for, and began the familiar ritual of trying to fit her legs into a space designed for people 8 inches shorter than her. The flight attendant offered her a pillow with a sympathetic smile, and Sarah accepted it gratefully, though no amount of pillows could make airline seats comfortable for someone her size. As the plane took off, she pressed her face to the window and watched Oklahoma City shrink below her. Somewhere down there was a world that might fit her better, but she had no map to find it. She had learned to navigate the world as it was, not as she wished it could be. The flight attendant came by with drinks, and Sarah ordered a coffee, black. The woman was petite and professional, probably 5.5 feet tall in her sensible airline shoes. She moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, serving passengers who fit comfortably in their seats, who could stand fully upright in the narrow aisle, who belonged in this manufactured environment in a way Sarah never would. But Sarah had built a life for herself despite the poor fit. She had a successful career that utilized her mind rather than her physical attributes. She had friends who valued her intelligence and humor. She had hobbies and interests that had nothing to do with her height. She had learned to find satisfaction in achievements that couldn't be measured in feet and inches. Still, as she sipped her coffee and listened to the drone of the engines, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was living a half-life. Not because she wasn't tall enough, but because she spent so much energy managing other people's reactions to her tallness that she rarely had space to simply exist as herself. The man in the seat next to her was reading a magazine, and she could see him occasionally glancing over at her, probably calculating her height and wondering if he should make conversation about it. She had learned to read these glances, to predict when someone was about to ask the question or make the comment. Instead of waiting for it, she put in her earbuds and closed her eyes, signaling that she wasn't available for conversation. It was a defensive strategy she had perfected over years of travel, a way to create a small bubble of peace in a world that felt entitled to comment on her body. As the plane flew through the afternoon sky towards Denver, Sarah let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like to walk through the world without her height being the first and most important thing people noticed about her. What it might feel like to be seen completely, to be known fully, to be loved not despite her tallness but including it as simply one part of the complex person she actually was. She didn't know it yet, but in a small town in eastern Oklahoma, a man was just finishing his workday, washing sawdust from his hands and thinking about the custom furniture order he would start tomorrow. A man who stood 2 inches in his work boots and had never once in his life wished he was smaller. A man who understood, in ways she couldn't yet imagine, what it meant to be built differently in a world of standard sizes. Their paths hadn't crossed yet, but they would soon, in a way that would change everything Sarah thought she knew about fitting in and standing out. About love and acceptance. About finding someone who didn't just tolerate your difference but celebrated it as exactly what they had been looking for all along. 3 months later, Sarah found herself driving through the winding roads of eastern Oklahoma, her rental car navigation system cheerfully directing her toward what she hoped would be a solution to her furniture problem. After years of struggling with standard-sized furniture that left her feeling like Alice in Wonderland after drinking the growing potion, she had finally decided to invest in custom pieces designed for someone her height. The decision had come after a particularly frustrating evening when she had hosted a dinner party and spent the entire night unconsciously hunched over her dining table, trying to eat at a comfortable angle, while her knees pressed against the underside of the table. Her guests hadn't seemed to notice her discomfort, but Sarah had felt every minute of it, a physical reminder that even in her own home, she was trying to fit into a world built for other people. Her research had led her to James Tallbear, a furniture maker whose online portfolio showed breathtaking custom pieces crafted from native woods. What had caught her attention wasn't just the quality of his work, but the fact that several pieces in his gallery were clearly designed for people of exceptional height. A dining table that looked like it could accommodate long legs, a desk chair with an extended back, a bed frame that could handle a mattress longer than the standard queen size. His website had been sparse on personal details, but it included a phone number and an address in Stigler, Oklahoma. When Sarah had called to inquire about custom work, his voice had been deep and unhurried, with a slight accent she couldn't quite place. He had asked thoughtful questions about her needs, her space, her preferences, without once asking about her height directly. Instead, he had asked about her ideal seating position, her preferred arm height for chairs, her thoughts on wood grain and finish. The conversation had lasted nearly an hour, and by the end of it, Sarah felt like he understood her furniture needs better than any salesperson she had ever encountered. When she had mentioned flying out to see his workshop and discuss the project in person, he had simply said, "I'll be here," in a tone that suggested he was always there, as permanent and reliable as the trees he worked with. Now, as she followed the GPS directions through increasingly rural landscape, Sarah began to wonder if she had made a mistake. The roads had narrowed from highway to 2-lane county roads to what appeared to be barely maintained rural routes. The landscape was beautiful, rolling hills covered in oak and pine with occasional glimpses of ponds and pastures, but it felt very far from civilization. She had grown up in suburban Denver and spent her adult life in cities where custom furniture meant going to a showroom in a shopping center and selecting from available options. This felt like an adventure into a completely different world, one where craftsmen worked in isolation and created pieces from raw timber rather than pre-manufactured components. The GPS announced that she was approaching her destination, and Sarah slowed the car looking for some sign of a furniture workshop. What she found instead was a long gravel driveway marked by a simple wooden sign that read, "Tallbear Woodworks." In letters that had been carved rather than painted, the natural wood showing through in elegant contrast, she turned down the drive, her rental car crunching over the gravel as she approached a cluster of buildings that looked like they had grown from the landscape rather than been imposed upon it. The main building was long and low, with large windows and what appeared to be a loading dock at one end. Beside it stood a smaller building that might have been a house, and beyond that she could see what looked like stacks of lumber under covered shelters. Sarah parked near the main building and sat in her car for a moment, gathering her courage. She had learned to approach new situations with a certain amount of defensive preparation, ready to handle comments about her height or assumptions about what she might need. But something about this place felt different. It felt designed by someone who understood that people came in different sizes, and that those differences might require thoughtful accommodation. She got out of the car and immediately noticed that the door to the workshop was taller than standard. Not dramatically so, but noticeably higher than the 6'8" doors that had forced her to duck her head in countless buildings. It was a small detail, but it made her feel like whoever had built this place understood something about the world that most builders missed. Before she could knock, the door opened, and Sarah found herself face to face with a man who changed her understanding of what it meant to be tall. James Tallbear stood in the doorway like a monument to the idea that some people were simply built on a different scale than others. At 7'2", he was the first person she had ever met who made her feel genuinely short. But it wasn't just his height that struck her. It was the way he carried himself, with none of the apologetic slouching she had learned to do. His shoulders were squared, his head high, as if he had never once considered that his size might be something to minimize. His dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and his hands, she noticed, were proportioned to match his frame, large and capable, stained with what looked like wood dye. "You must be Sarah," he said, his voice the same deep, unhurried tone she remembered from their phone conversation. "I'm James. Welcome to my workshop." "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," Sarah replied, and realized she wasn't tilting her head back as much as she usually did when talking to people. The angle felt natural, comfortable, as if she were finally having a conversation with someone built on her scale. "Not short notice at all. I've been looking forward to this."
"Please, come in and see what we're working with."
He stepped aside to let her enter, and Sarah walked into a space that immediately felt like home in a way she had never experienced.
The ceiling was high, at least 10 feet, maybe 12, and every work surface, every tool rack, every piece of equipment was positioned as if it had been designed for people of their height. She realized she was standing fully upright without thinking about it, without checking for low beams or hanging lights. The workshop smelled of wood shavings and natural oils, a rich, organic scent that spoke of living materials and patient craftsmanship. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating workbenches covered with hand tools that looked like they had been made specifically for James's large hands. In various stages of completion, she could see pieces of furniture that were clearly custom work: a dining table with an unusually high clearance, a bookshelf that reached nearly to the ceiling, a rocking chair with an extended back and seat depth. "This is incredible," Sarah said, and meant it. "It feels like a workshop built for giants." James smiled, and she noticed that his smile was easy and genuine, without the self-consciousness she had learned to expect when people discussed height. "I suppose it is. I learned early on that if I was going to spend my days working with my hands, I needed tools and spaces that fit my hands and my body. No point in fighting your own size." He gestured toward a tall stool beside one of the workbenches. "Have a seat, and tell me more about what you're looking for." "I've got some sketches based on our phone conversation, but I'd like to hear more about how you live in your space." Sarah settled onto the stool, which was exactly the right height for her long legs, and felt something inside her relax that she hadn't even realized was tense. For the first time in memory, she was in a space where her proportions felt normal, where the furniture had been designed with people like her in mind.
"I'd been living with standard furniture my entire adult life," she began, "and I'm finally ready to invest in pieces that actually fit."
"My dining table is too low, my desk chair doesn't support my back properly, and my bed frame is too short for the mattress I need." James nodded as she spoke, occasionally jotting notes on a piece of paper. His attention was focused entirely on her words, not on her physical appearance, and Sarah found herself speaking more freely than she had in similar conversations with other furniture makers. "Tell me about your daily routines," he said. "How do you prefer to sit when you're working? When you're eating? When you're relaxing?" The questions were practical and specific, focused on function rather than form. Sarah described her work habits, her entertaining style, her preferences for firm versus soft seating. James asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he was really listening, really thinking about how to create pieces that would serve her specific needs. "I brought some initial sketches," he said, pulling out a large sketchbook. "But I want to show you something else first." He led her to the far end of the workshop, where a dining set sat in a small mock-up of a dining room. The table was clearly designed for tall people, higher than standard, with generous legroom underneath. The chairs were proportioned to match, with extended backs and deeper seats than typical dining chairs. "This is a set I made for a client in Texas," James explained. "He's 6'8", and his wife is 6'2". They wanted something that would work for both of them, and still look elegant when they entertained guests of normal height. Sarah approached the table and immediately saw how thoughtfully it had been designed. The height provided comfortable clearance for long legs without making shorter guests feel like children in adult furniture. The wood was a rich walnut with grain that flowed naturally across the surface, and the joinery was so precise it looked like the pieces had grown together rather than been assembled. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward one of the chairs. "Please." She sat down and felt her body settle into the chair, as if it had been made specifically for her. The back support hit exactly the right spot. The seat depth was perfect for her leg length, and the arm height allowed her to rest her elbows comfortably. For the first time in her adult life, she was sitting in a chair that fit her completely. "This is amazing," she said, and heard the wonder in her own voice. "I had no idea furniture could feel like this." "Most people don't," James said. "The furniture industry builds for average heights, and if you're not average, you learn to make do. But there's no reason to make do when you can have pieces designed for exactly who you are." He opened his sketchbook and showed her drawings that captured not just the dimensions of the pieces she needed, but their spirit. The dining table he had sketched for her was similar in concept to the one she was sitting at, but adapted to her specific preferences. The desk was designed to accommodate her work setup while providing the support her back needed during long days. The bed frame was elegant and substantial, designed to handle an oversized mattress without looking disproportionate. "These are beautiful," Sarah said, studying the detailed drawings. "But I have to ask, how do you know so much about designing for tall people?" James was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "I've been my height since I was 16, he said finally. "Spent my teenage years learning what it meant to be built differently than everyone around me. When I decided to become a furniture maker, I realized I could either keep struggling with tools and spaces designed for other people, or I could create an environment that worked for me." He gestured around the workshop. "Everything you see here, the height of the workbenches, the positioning of the tools, the design of the space, it's all sized for someone my proportions. And once I started making furniture for myself, I realized there were probably other people out there who had been making do with furniture that didn't fit them either." "How did you learn to do this?" Sarah asked. "I mean, the craftsmanship is incredible." "My grandfather was a furniture maker," James said. "Cherokee traditional woodworking, mostly, but he understood modern techniques too. He started teaching me when I was 12, partly to give me something to do with my hands, and partly because he said I was going to be too big for most jobs and needed to learn how to create my own work." He ran his hand along the surface of the table they were sitting at, his fingers tracing the grain with obvious affection. "He taught me that wood wants to be beautiful, that every piece of timber has its own character, and your job as a craftsman is to discover what it wants to become. But he also taught me practical things, how to design pieces that would last, how to join wood so it stays strong through decades of use, how to finish pieces so they age gracefully." "Is he still?" Sarah began. "He passed when I was in my 20s, James said, "but his tools are still here, and his techniques. Cherokee woodworking traditions go back generations, and there's a lot of wisdom in those old methods." Sarah looked around the workshop with new eyes, noticing details she had missed before. Some of the tools looked handmade, crafted with techniques that were probably centuries old. The wood stains seemed to be natural rather than chemical, creating colors that looked like they came from the earth itself. "So you're Cherokee?" she asked. "Half Cherokee, half Irish," James said with a slight smile. "My grandmother used to say I got the Cherokee connection to the natural world and the Irish stubbornness. Seemed like a good combination for someone who works with wood." They spent the next 2 hours going over Sarah's specific needs, with James asking detailed questions about her lifestyle and preferences. He measured her proportions, not in the clinical way of a tailor, but with the careful attention of someone who understood that good furniture design required understanding the person who would use it. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't experienced in years. James never once commented on her height, except in the practical context of furniture design. He didn't ask if she played basketball or suggest she should be a model. He didn't treat her size as a curiosity or a conversation starter. Instead, he treated her height as simply one of many factors that would inform his design decisions, no more remarkable than her preference for hardwood over softwood, or her need for a desk with built-in cable management. More than that, his own comfort with his exceptional height seemed to create a space where her height could simply exist without explanation or justification. For the first time in her adult life, she was spending time with someone who understood, from personal experience, what it meant to be built on a different scale than the average person. When the sun began to set, Casting long shadows through the workshop windows, James walked her back to her car. "I'll have detailed plans and a timeline ready within a week," he said. "Once you approve the designs, I estimate about 6 weeks for completion." "That sounds perfect," Sarah said, though she realized she was reluctant to leave. The workshop had felt like a sanctuary, a place where her size was accommodated rather than tolerated. "There's a good bed and breakfast about 20 minutes from here," James said. "The Hensley House. Tell Martha I sent you. She'll take good care of you."
Thank you, Sarah said.
"For everything. It's been really wonderful." "I enjoyed it too," James said, and something in his tone made Sarah look at him more carefully. There was warmth in his voice that went beyond professional courtesy, a genuine pleasure in their conversation that had nothing to do with business. As she drove away from the workshop, following James's directions toward the bed and breakfast, Sarah found herself thinking not just about the furniture he would create for her, but about the man himself. There had been something about spending time with someone who shared her experience of the world, someone who understood what it meant to navigate spaces designed for other people, that had felt like coming home to a place she hadn't known she was looking for. Sarah had planned to fly back to Denver the next morning, but something about the quiet beauty of eastern Oklahoma made her extend her trip by 2 days. The Hensley House bed and breakfast that James had recommended turned out to be a restored Victorian mansion with unusually high ceilings and a proprietor, Martha Hensley, who took one look at Sarah and immediately offered her the tower room. "It's got the tallest doorways in the house," Martha explained, as she led Sarah up a winding staircase. "Built in 1897 by a man who was apparently quite tall for his time. Most folks find it a bit overwhelming, but I think you'll appreciate the proportions." The room was indeed perfectly proportioned for someone Sarah's height, with a 4-poster bed that was longer than standard and a writing desk positioned at a comfortable height near a tall window. But more than the physical comfort, Sarah found herself drawn to the peaceful rhythm of life in this small town, so different from the constant motion of Denver. She spent her first morning exploring Stigler, which turned out to be a town of about 3,000 people nestled in the foothills of the Ouachita Mountains. Main Street was lined with buildings that dated back to the early 1900s, their facades telling the story of a community that had grown slowly and organically, rather than being planned by developers. At the local coffee shop, a place called the Daily Grind that occupied a narrow storefront between an antique store and a florist, Sarah discovered that being unusually tall in a small town carried a different social weight than it did in the city. The barista, a woman in her 60s with grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, simply nodded when Sarah ducked slightly to enter through the standard height door. "You must be the furniture customer James mentioned," she said without preamble. "I'm Helen Morrison. My late husband was 6'6", so I know what it's like to live with someone who doesn't quite fit standard sizes. What can I get you?" The directness was refreshing. No gasping, no comments about basketball, no unsolicited suggestions about career choices. Just acknowledgement and immediate acceptance, as if tall people were simply one of many types of people who occasionally passed through town and needed coffee. "Just a regular coffee, please," Sarah said, "and maybe some advice about what to see while I'm here." "Well, if you're interested in local history, the museum has some good displays about the Cherokee heritage of this area. If you like nature, there are some beautiful hiking trails in this, and if you want to understand why James Tallbear makes the furniture he does, you should visit his grandfather's old place." Helen poured coffee from a thermal carafe, her movements efficient and practiced. Joseph Tallbear was quite a man. Traditional Cherokee woodworker, but he understood modern techniques too. He's the one who taught James that being different isn't a problem to solve, it's a perspective to honor. "James mentioned him," Sarah said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "It sounds like he had a big influence." "Oh, he did. Joseph used to say that the Cherokee have always understood that people come in different sizes and shapes, and that a good community makes room for all of them. He taught James traditional building techniques that create spaces for people rather than making people adapt to spaces." Helen leaned against the counter, clearly settling in for a longer conversation. "You know, we've had several people come through here over the years looking for custom furniture from James. Most of them are folks who've spent their whole lives trying to fit into a world that wasn't designed for them. By the time they find their way here, they're ready for something different." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "I mean, they're ready to stop apologizing for taking up space. Ready to have furniture that fits them instead of trying to fit themselves to furniture. James has a gift for understanding that transition, probably because he made it himself when he was young." Sarah sipped her coffee and considered this. She had never thought about it in quite those terms, but Helen was right. Coming here had felt like finally allowing herself to want furniture that actually fit, rather than continuing to adapt herself to furniture that didn't. His grandfather's place is about 10 miles out of town, Helen continued. James keeps it maintained, visits pretty regularly. It's where he learned to work with wood, and it's where he goes when he needs to think through a particularly challenging design. After finishing her coffee, Sarah decided to follow Helen's suggestion and visit the local museum. The Haskell County Historical Society occupied a converted schoolhouse on the outskirts of town, and its exhibits told the story of the area's Cherokee heritage with obvious pride and careful attention to accuracy. She learned that this part of Oklahoma had been home to Cherokee communities for generations, both before and after the forced relocations of the 1830s. The museum's woodworking display included several pieces made by Joseph Tallbear, and Sarah could see the influence of traditional Cherokee techniques in their construction. The joinery was similar to what she had observed in James's work, but these older pieces incorporated decorative elements that spoke of cultural traditions passed down through generations. A volunteer docent, an elderly Cherokee man named Robert Swimmer, noticed her studying the woodworking display with particular interest. "Are you here about James Tallbear's furniture?" he asked. "How did you know?" Sarah asked, surprised. Robert smiled. "You're tall, you're looking at Joseph's work with the eye of someone who understands craftsmanship. And Helen Morrison called to tell me there was a furniture customer in town who might appreciate the cultural context of what James does." Sarah laughed. "Small towns really are different, aren't they?" "In the best ways," Robert agreed. "Joseph Tallbear was my cousin, and he taught James more than just woodworking techniques. He taught him that Cherokee builders have always understood something that modern builders forgot, that you design for the people who will use the space, not for some abstract average person." He gestured toward a photograph showing Joseph working in his shop, surrounded by tools and partially completed furniture pieces. Traditional Cherokee architecture was always adaptable. "We built homes that could be modified for different family sizes, different needs. Joseph brought that philosophy to furniture making, and James carries it on." "It's remarkable," Sarah said, studying the photograph. Joseph had been a tall man, she could see, though not as tall as his grandson, but there was something in his posture, in the way he held himself, that reminded her of James, a sense of complete comfort with his own physical presence. "James told me once that his grandfather taught him that wood has memory," Robert continued, "that it remembers being a living tree, remembers the wind and the rain and the seasons. A good woodworker honors that memory and helps the wood become something beautiful that will last for generations." That afternoon, Sarah found herself driving the rural roads outside Stigler, following directions Helen had written on a napkin to find Joseph Tallbear's old place. The route took her through increasingly wild country, past farms and pastures and into forested hills that felt ancient and undisturbed. The property, when she found it, was set back from the road down a gravel lane that wound through tall oaks and pines. The house was modest, built in the 1940s but clearly maintained with care. Beside it stood what had obviously been Joseph's workshop, a building similar in design to James's current shop, but smaller and somehow more rustic. Sarah parked and was considering whether she had any right to be there when James emerged from the workshop, carrying what appeared to be a hand plane that he was examining closely. "I thought I might find you here," he said, walking over to her car with an easy smile. "Helen called to say she'd sent you in this direction." "I hope you don't mind," Sarah said, getting out of the car. "I was curious about where you learned to do what you do." "Not at all. I'm glad you came. I was just going through some of my grandfather's old tools, deciding which ones to restore and which ones to retire." "Would you like to see his workshop?" The building was smaller than James's current facility, but Sarah could immediately see the similarities in design philosophy. Everything was built for a tall man's comfort, and the tool arrangements reflected the same thoughtful consideration of ergonomics and efficiency that characterized James's work. "This is where it all started," James said, running his hand along a workbench that was clearly handmade. "My grandfather built this shop in 1952, after he got back from Korea. He said he'd spent 2 years cramped in spaces built for smaller men, and he was done accommodating himself to other people's ideas about what size things should be. The workshop walls were lined with tools, many of them obviously handmade. Sarah recognized some as traditional woodworking implements, but others were unfamiliar, their purposes unclear, but their craftsmanship evident.
"These are Cherokee woodworking tools," James explained, noticing her interest.
"Some of the techniques go back centuries, adapted over time but never abandoned." My grandfather taught me that there's wisdom in old methods, especially when you're trying to create something that will outlast you. He picked up a curved knife with an elaborately carved handle. This is for shaping wood to follow natural grain patterns. Modern power tools can cut wood any way you want, but traditional tools teach you to work with the wood rather than forcing it into shapes it doesn't want to hold. Is that a Cherokee philosophy? Sarah asked. It's a human philosophy that Cherokee culture preserved, James said. The idea that you work with natural materials rather than against them, that you honor the inherent qualities of what you're working with rather than trying to impose your will on it. They spent the afternoon in the workshop, with James showing Sarah tools and techniques that his grandfather had taught him. But more than the technical knowledge, Sarah began to understand something deeper about James's approach to his craft. He wasn't just making furniture, he was carrying forward a way of thinking about the relationship between people and the objects they lived with. My grandfather used to say that good furniture should make people feel at home in their own bodies, James said as they examined a rocking chair that Joseph had made in the 1960s, that if you're constantly adjusting your posture or feeling uncomfortable, the furniture is failing in its basic purpose. Sarah sat in the rocking chair and immediately understood what Joseph had meant. The chair cradled her long frame perfectly, supporting her back while allowing her legs to stretch comfortably. The rocking motion was smooth and natural, as if the chair had been designed specifically for her proportions. He was right, she said. I've never sat in a rocking chair that actually fit me before. Most rocking chairs are built for people about 5.5 feet tall, James said. If you're significantly taller or shorter than that, they don't work properly. The proportions are all wrong, and you end up fighting the chair instead of relaxing in it. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself drawn into deeper conversations with James about craftsmanship, about the philosophy behind his work, about what it meant to create objects that would outlast their makers. But underneath these practical discussions, she was increasingly aware of the man himself, his thoughtfulness, his connection to his cultural heritage, his obvious respect for the natural materials he worked with. When the sun began to set, James offered to show her some of the hiking trails in the area. They walked through forests that felt primeval, along paths that wound between trees that were clearly decades old, possibly centuries. The scale of the landscape seemed to match their own proportions. Everything was larger than life, designed by nature for creatures who needed room to move. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, Sarah said as they paused at a clearing that offered a view of the surrounding hills. About not fighting your own size. What about it? James asked. I realize I've spent most of my adult life trying to minimize my impact, trying to take up less space both physically and socially. It's exhausting, and I don't think I understood how exhausting until I spent time in your workshop yesterday. James was quiet for a moment, considering her words. It took me a long time to learn that lesson too, he said finally. I spent my teenage years slouching, trying to make myself seem less imposing. My grandfather finally sat me down when I was about 17 and told me that disrespecting my own body was also disrespecting the creator who made me that way. What changed for you? Sarah asked. I started building things for myself instead of trying to adapt myself to things built for other people. Once I had workbenches that were the right height, tools that fit my hands, spaces where I could stand up straight, everything else started to feel different too. They continued walking as the light faded, and Sarah found herself sharing things about her life that she rarely discussed with anyone. The loneliness of being perpetually different, the way dating felt like an elaborate performance designed to make others comfortable with her size, the exhaustion of constantly managing other people's reactions to her height. I've been alone for a long time, she said, as they reached the parking area where she had left her rental car. Not by choice exactly, but because it seemed easier than dealing with all the complications that come with dating when you're my size. Easier isn't the same as better, James said quietly. No, Sarah agreed. It isn't. They stood beside her car in the gathering darkness, and Sarah felt the weight of the moment. She would be flying back to Denver the next day, returning to her regular life, to furniture that didn't fit and a world that constantly reminded her of her difference. But something had shifted during these 2 days in Oklahoma, something that made the prospect of returning to her old patterns feel impossible.